The railways crisscrossed hundreds of miles of Derbyshire, Staffordshire and Cheshire, and although their building and closure had a huge effect on both people in the countryside, some industrial enterprises had an impact that was truly colossal.
By the 19th century, the Industrial Revolution was in full swing. Britain's industrial cities were growing at a furious rate and rapidly consuming resources. One of the most important of those resources was water, not just to power the mills and the factories, but also clean, fresh drinking water for the population. During Victorian times, cholera ran riot, killing thousands of people. Not only that, the factories and mills had to shut down in the summer when the rivers ran dry. A solution was rapidly needed, and the Victorians met the challenge in grand style, constructing massive reservoirs containing thousands of gallons of water.
The Peak District was a perfect location for the new reservoirs. Not only was it enclosed by many of England's major industrial cities, but it also had three important features that must be present for any reservoir: steep-sided valleys, impermeable geology, and lots of rain. The Victorians were spoilt for choice. One of the first major dam projects was that of Dale Dyke on the outskirts of Sheffield. The aim was simple: block up the deep valley with a dam, store the water behind it, and control the river throughout the year to keep a constant supply of water to Sheffield's mills. The dam was constructed using a newly designed watertight clay core surrounded by an earthen bank. It took 5 years to construct and was completed in the February of 1864.
On the night of March the 11th, a strong wind was blowing from the southwest. A workman who was crossing over the newly completed dam noticed a large crack. He sent immediately for the engineers, but it was too late. The dam burst. A massive torrent of water headed straight down the valley towards Sheffield. 600 homes were destroyed and 238 people lost their lives. It became the worst disaster to ever hit peacetime Britain.
These contemporary sketches show just some of the damage that was inflicted throughout the valley. It's hard to imagine the sheer force of this tidal wave and the impact it had on so many people.
But the Dale Dyke disaster is still remembered. The stone behind me is a memorial to all those who lost their lives that night. And here at my feet, this pillar marks the central line of the original bank of the dam. An inquest found that the cause of the disaster was unsuitable geology, and in 1875 the dam was reconstructed 600 metres further up the valley. Lessons were learnt, but most importantly, the consequence of the Dale Dyke disaster would have a direct impact on what was to become the Peak District's largest water scheme.
Even after these events, Sheffield was still in desperate need of water, and they acted quickly to rebuild the reservoir. Learning from their mistakes, the second dam remains thankfully stable to this day. But although Dale Dyke and several other reservoirs were constructed in the decades to follow, it was just not enough to quench Sheffield's thirst. After studying both the geography and geology of the Peak District, a new site was decided upon for what was to become Britain's largest ever reservoir system, the Derwent Valley. In 1899, the Derwent Valley Water Board was formed, which commissioned 2 reservoirs in the heart of the upper Derwent Valley. After a great deal of research, the board of directors were greatly impressed by the engineering work of Edward Sandeman, who had constructed several successful reservoirs in the southwest of England. Learning from the Dale Dyke disaster, Sandeman decided to construct both dams from masonry. To be named Derwent and Howden, construction work began on the dams in 1901.
Ravages of the dam building upon the valley, they couldn't excavate the thousands of tons of rock that was required from the valley sides themselves. Instead, they turned to the small village of Brindleford, some 10 kilometres down the valley. They constructed a large quarry and built a light railway that headed up the side of the Derwent Reservoir here. We're now standing in the remains of the ancillary works, and although very little survives, you can still see over on this side the remains of the stone crushers. Here, the raw rock was placed inside the crushers and ground down to a very manageable size for use in the concrete and cements. As well as that, they also had stone saws operating here, and it would have been a hive of industry, but also quite a dangerous place. With the heavy machinery, with the saws and with the rock, it would be very easy for a fragment to go into your eye and cause blindness, or even to lose a limb. And sadly, accidents did happen during the construction. The construction of the two dams was undertaken on the most part by navvies. These were groups of men who travelled the country and acquired their name for their habit of building or navigating the railway and canal networks which were springing up all across Britain. However, they were shunned by society. They received very little pay. The conditions they lived in would often be loose-built shacks with no running water and no sanitation. But luckily, their saviour came in the form of an Act of Parliament, and it was decreed that when undertaking any major construction project, they must have adequate housing. Edward Sandeman decided he was going to build them a settlement halfway between the reservoirs at Derwent and Howden. And this is what remains of the area now. Although it looks only like a series of platforms, in fact, in front of me was once a main road. And lining the sides here were small tin huts in which they lived. But they were very comfortable accommodation. They had running water, they had gas, and most importantly of all, they had a school, they had a church, they had a shop, they even had a police station, which all in all meant a vast improvement in the workers' lives and of course of their rights as well. Today you can walk along the main streets and see the points at which the small wooden stairways would have led up to the workers' homes. Although tin on the outside, inside they were very comfortable. Often they'd be wooden lined, they'd have pictures, they'd have ornaments, and it became a much more comfortable place and a nice community for the navvies to live in.
These images of Tin Town illustrate not only the skillful design of the settlement, but also how comfortable it was for the workers. One of the biggest problems was making sure the men didn't spend all their wages in the pub before they could get home. You can still walk around the site of Tin Town today, though overgrown, the streets and platforms are clearly visible. The dams were constructed from the centre towards the edges of the valley. However, nearing completion of the Howden Dam in 1908, a massive problem was reached. Although the valley bottom had been surveyed and was found to be geologically suitable, the surveyors failed to study the valley sides, and when reached, they found the rock was permeable. This meant that once the reservoirs began to fill, water would leak from either side through the edges of the dam. Desperate to solve the problem, Sandeman came up with an extreme solution. He instructed the navvies to probe further and further up the valley sides until they could find an impermeable rock band. Almost a kilometre up, Sandeman's risk paid off, and watertight rock was located. He ordered a narrow trench, an incredible 50 metres deep, to be dug and filled with concrete, lining the valley with a watertight blanket. It set the waterboard back considerably in terms of added expenditure and an ever-distant completion date, but Sandeman's gamble saved the whole project.
A colossal 200,000 tonnes of stone went into the building of the Derwent and Howden reservoirs, and £3.5 million was spent, a staggering sum in those days. The scale of the dams is truly epic. Allow me to illustrate.
It's several hundred feet from where I'm standing to the base of the dam, and when there, I almost disappear into the sheer mass of the stone. The dams are still some of the largest in Britain. They appear spectacular enough in dry weather, but in the height of winter they become even more dramatic when the peaty waters cascade down the dam face. the rough gritstone breaks the sheet into thousands of intricate cascades. From above the dams, strong winds can whip the falling waters into ghostly sprites that dance along the cascading edges. Even after the construction of Derwent and Howden, the sprawling urban masses around the Peak District still needed more water, and the solution to this was to build a third and final reservoir, one so immense that it would contain more water than both Derwent and Howden combined. This superstructure was to be built just below the current reservoirs, but surveying found the area to be geologically unsuitable for another masonry dam, and so the decision was made to make it out of clay and earth. This worried a large number of people who remembered the Dale Dyke disaster, but design had advanced a long way, and confidence was soon instilled that the new dam, to be named Lady Bower, would be a complete success. The biggest public issue, however, was not the dam, but what was in the valleys themselves.
When the line was drawn on the map, there was a realisation that the construction of this third and final reservoir would result in the destruction of two villages, those of Derwent and Ashipton. Derwent lay just below me in the small bay where a river enters into what is now the bulk of Lady Bower Reservoir. Higher up the reservoir was the remains of Derwent Hall, owned by the Duke of Norfolk. The people who lived in the two villages were tenants of his farms and his land, and when he decided to sell to the Water Board, the villagers knew that their days were numbered.
As the construction on the dam began, the villagers began to pack up their belongings and witnessed their lives and community being slowly and inexorably demolished. When the dam was completed in 1945, there was one last service in the church before the congregation paid a final farewell. As the reservoir slowly began to fill, the tower of the church was allowed to remain standing as an unofficial monument to the proud history soon to be lost below the waters of Lady Bower. Sadly, the tower can no longer be seen. When water levels fell for the first time, it was found to have become unstable, and so the decision was made to demolish the tower with explosives on the 15th of December 1947. Local legend still says that on moonlit nights, You can hear the bells of the church ringing from below the waves. Lady Bower was officially opened by King George VI, accompanied by Queen Elizabeth, on the 25th of September 1945. The huge dam contains over 1 million tonnes of earth and 100,000 tonnes of clay at its core. The dam's design is also unusual in having 2 totally enclosed bell mouth overflows at each side. Constructed of stone, they are 80 foot wide and 15 foot deep, each discharging the waters via its own valve house at the base of the dam. They are often completely out of the water and only become submerged after heavy rainfall. At maximum fill level, Lady Bower can hold almost 28 million square metres of water. Today, these massive reservoirs remain in constant use, over 100 years after they were first constructed. They stand not only as a water supply for Sheffield, Derby and Leicester, but also a testament to the skills of those intrepid Victorian engineers.